inside, outside, outside, inside, outside the inside, inside the outside. I've titled paintings many variations on the theme. And it was only, I have to say, later in life, it was drawn to my attention by curators. There might be a link between the fact that my grandfather had a department store and my representation of shops in my paintings. My first shop paintings were painted about 20 years ago. They were of shoe shops. And it was before shoes became such a everywhere image. So I could really attack it from an emotional and psychoanalytic level. And one of the things that I really became aware of was how when you step into different pairs of shoes, you take on a different public persona. And I was then led me to very interesting ideas on a psychoanalytic level, how we also step into roles all the time. I remember going home and saying, which assembly should I go to? Am I Jewish or am I Christian? And she said, you're Jewish. And then she began to explain about, all I knew was that, this is the connection I made, that there were nasty Nazis, nasty bad men and women, and black leather and brown textiles. Because what I realised thereafter was that my mother would unconsciously go stiff if she saw black leather when we went into town on the tube, and she very rarely spoke when I was very young about what had happened. But as I grew older, towards into my 10, 11, she began to tell me more. Most of her family had not got out and died. Her rage, she turned inwards. My mother, no doubt. For days, I remember her having terrible headaches and backaches, and sometimes she'd go to bed for the day. And I remember sitting outside the bedroom. I was always worried about her. But I realise that now, with retrospect, that she got very low. Even though she was a very fun-loving person and liked partying, loved people, there was this other side to her. I remember when I was 12 she kept on telling me, I keep on tripping up, I'm sure it's my high heels. She used to love shoes. And she began to wear flat shoes. And it was the beginning of her MS. But then, double whammy, she got myeloid leukemia, which actually was what killed her in the end. And so she had it was a really terrible, those diseases together was awful. She died when I was 18. And it was difficult to watch. It wasn't until I started psychotherapy many years later that I could begin to acknowledge the profundity of that loss. And I remember, I think it was perhaps the 15th anniversary of one of her birthdays, I started a habit of painting her. Every August the 22nd, I started a new painting of her. And that was a really wonderful coming together of acceptance and bringing her back on board as a living person, not just as a dying mother, but as a living woman. And that, I think, was very, very important to me. So I began this series of paintings of shops, mainly because I like to window shop, don't like shopping much, but also because of all these things, all these still lives that suddenly appeared in their right context. No contrivance, they were just of course they were contrived, they were window dressing, but they were there to allure, to seduce, and also that objects have history. And I also started painting charity shops and being very moved by objects that had had a life, that someone had loved these things, and then suddenly death, and then they come into another life. So there is this connection on many levels I have with objects and things of seduction and beauty that then just get left. Like my mother's wardrobe, you know, it fell to my shoulders, because I was the only one living at home still, to clear out the wardrobe. And you have suddenly objects devoid of meaning. They are just what they are. They're a thing in themselves. And they have no meaning because the person or the things that were animate about them no longer animate them. And I'm very interested in this idea in my shop paintings, and the fact that you can be inside this world of wishing for things, but knowing they're not going to make you any happier. And I think that's what the painting behind me is about. Longing. They become Eifersucht in German. There's this poetic notion of longing. I think that's the right word. The idea of inside, outside, outside, inside also chimed with how I always felt. Always on the edge, but that's also to do with, I think, painting or writing or looking at things, but also knowing you're part of them. Of course I was and am. But there was that conscious feeling of not quite fitting in. But I'm also very aware of waves of asylum seekers and people who've come afterwards, and people who are on the street sleeping rough. These people are in society, but they're on the edge of it until they're absorbed into it and or cared for by it. And you know, these are central questions of humanity. My father was frail, and obviously your body's very old when it hits 90. He was still quite vibrant, and he was up until he was about 85. Oh, he'd had cancer, all the things you get if you live old. And it became a hospital painting, sitting up in his hospital chair, propped up with pillows. And then again, it became the formal thing. I liked the dark of his dressing gown against the white and these formal things. And I had this real struggle. Do I put in all the accoutrements of intensive care and or the ward care? And I decided to keep it as simple as possible. And he was still talking, he was still animated, because up until that time, he was still sitting up for his meals, getting into the other chair, this tall chair, you know, these special chairs, and talking to me about stuff, as I called it, stuff. So this painting of him half in and out the world, you can see in the painting he's frail, he's ill. And I knew you get a feeling, you know, this was not going to be a survivable for much longer. And I was going to call it the final painting. And I thought, oh my God, I can't. Final solution. I can never think of final without thinking of the final solution. And so I decided to call it the last portrait. So I have the first portrait of my mother, which is very meaningful to me, and the last portrait of my father, which is very meaningful to me. The resurrection shuffle, you could call it, resurrected my mother, and the shuffle of the demise into oblivion, really.